Hey, I'm going to show you how to get your real drums from sounding like this to this. With no mixing, no EQ, no compression, just using a bit of balance and some TCI files. Okay, so to use these TCI files, you need the program Slate Trigger, and this is made by Stephen Slate or Slate Audio. I am in no way affiliated with them, but if you're mixing real drums and you want to blend in samples, this is the best plugin out there that I've tried to do it with. So TCI files are multiple velocity drum samples where you've got, like, let's say in most instances, at least with snare drums, I've usually got around 7 layers. So hardest layers being like your rim shots, slightly quieter rim shots, and then going lower and lower in volume until you're pretty much at a ghost note. And usually around 5 to 7 hits in each velocity range. And basically the TCIs have all of these samples in one, and they just trigger off the volume that you're sending to them. So before we get ahead of ourselves, this is how it sounds with just raw drums. Now the cymbals are processed and everything else in the mix is mixed, but I've taken off any processing from the real kick, real snare, and the real toms. And this is how it sounds. So first off, I'm going to loop this section and we're just going to listen to the raw kick drum. So these are the drums performed by Ali on the Sarlosis record. Great sounding kit, one of the best metal drummers out there, incredibly consistent playing, but natural drums, no matter how well they're recorded, are usually somewhat underwhelming in a mixed context. So we recorded a few other mics. Just for now, I'm just going to go off this 91 kick mic, which was inside the drum. Now you can directly trigger off this if you wanted to. So what we'd do, we're going to open up Trigger, or Trigger 2, which is the version they're on currently. Going to go to my settings and select the folder. So here we go. This is all the various kicks in the library, and we can just open a bunch of them. I'm just going to use the close mics for these, and we can just kind of load up a bunch of different ones. Now you could blend them all together, but in this case I'm just going to show you how you might want to just go about, testing them all out on their own and see which kick you like the sound of in your mix. I'm selecting some of my personal favorites from the library, at least for this type of metal. Okay, so we've got 4 of the kicks there. There's 4 more to choose from, but let's just leave it at that for now. So basically, what Trigger is going to do, it's going to mute all of these but this first one. Now we're going to press play, and you're going to see that Trigger is detecting where the hits are on the kick mic and how we can set the threshold. So this mix control here, if we turn it down, that's the real mic sound, and that's the fully replaced kick. So you can set the detail, which is how low in volume you want it to pick up hits. Now if I go too low with this kick drum, it might start picking up snare hits as well, and it's putting the snares as like a lower velocity kick hit, which is not something we want. So we can set it up here, or here maybe, just to be sure. And you can also change on this section here, the volume, the level that you're sending into Trigger. And the lower volume and the lower detail, it's going to trigger some lower velocity samples, so it sounds like he's hitting the kick lighter, even though this is fully sample replaced. So one thing I usually do with most metal that I'm mixing is for kicks, I don't really need any dynamics. So normally I'm down in this area and I'm putting the dynamic range from 127 to 127. So no dynamic range and turning the dynamics off. So this will just only trigger samples at the highest velocity, but it's going to leave some of the dynamics in just in terms of the level of the volume. And to get rid of that, we can just turn this dynamics all the way to the left, and this is just going to make every single kick come out at the same volume. But there are multiple samples at this same velocity, so you're not just going to hear the same sample fired off in a row in succession. So these are all going to be triggering different samples even though it's at the same velocity. I'll put that volume back. And the detail's a bit too... There we go. Cool. So this is how that sounds in context. And let's go straight to the snare drum. Go to settings, select the folder that the files are in. Now, one of my favorite snares in the library is the Gretsch Bell Brass in the lower tuning. Now, admittedly, with the labeling, it isn't necessarily a low tuning. Just out of the 3 tunings of this drum, this is the lowest one. Now, with snare drums, I like to blend in the overhead mic. With the close mic, this is exactly the same sounds as the contact instrument. So this is fully processed, EQ'd, compressed, some one-shot samples already blended in at the highest velocity. So that is good to go. The overhead mic is processed as well. So let's just solo the snare. Now you can hear a bit of roominess on the overhead because that's just the room that it was tracked in. These drums were recorded at Middle Farm Studios, and that's kind of a bit of the room decay you can hear in the background there. A smaller studio, you'd just hear less of that sort of natural room reverb. So let's listen to these two together, and one thing worth checking when blending in an overhead mic with a close mic is the phase, which we change with this button here. So let's just listen to the two. Cool. So having a bit more of the overhead mic gives you a bit more of that kind of wood blocky sort of like mid-range clack, which you might like. I like blending in, at least with this sample in particular, a bit of the overhead. I think it sounds pretty cool, adds to a bit more of that pop sound. So let's listen to that in context with the triggered kick as well. So already that is sounding like a finished mix. We didn't do anything to the drums, no EQ, no compression. We've just loaded up the samples, and the samples are already EQ'd, compressed, and processed in a way where they should sound good in the mix. So let's hit play in this section and hear how some of these different kicks sound in mix context. Now this is probably my favorite kick in the whole library, the Tama 22 with no resonant head on the bass drum, and that's usually my preferred way of getting a kick drum sound, taking the resonant head off. I think I just prefer the way the attack sounds when miking a kick like this. So this is I think my personal favorite. It's got a really fat low end to it as well. And then this Yamaha one. Another great feature in Trigger is the ability to change the tuning really easily and do it in a way where it just still holds up, sounds really good, it doesn't degrade the sound too much. Cool, so let's leave it with this one. So as I said, this is fully processed EQ, compression, maybe a bit of tape saturation on the samples. So you don't need to do anything. They just sound like this as soon as you load them up. Now obviously every mix is different, so you may want to just, sculpt it a bit more to fit your mix. But in most cases, these are just going to sound really good as they are. So onto the snare drum. Now one thing I like doing with this sample in particular is pitching it down just a little bit as well. And if you're doing it on the close mic, you need to make sure you're doing it on the overhead as well. Really like that snare sound, but let's check out some other samples and see how they sound. I'm just going to load the close mics up for now. But normally I would like to have the overhead mic blended in as well, and always making sure that we're checking the phase. So I'm going to load up some pretty different sounding samples now. So this one in particular here is particularly low and fat sounding. And then we're going to switch it out for one that is a bit more cranked and has a bit more pop and ring to it, which I also really like. And we can just kind of scroll through these in context as well. I'm going to mute a bunch of these first. So this is the original sample we had. So it completely depends on what sort of drum sound you like, what sort of snare characteristic you want to go for. There's tons of different options here. Now obviously these aren't all the drums in the library, all the snare drums, and it's not even half of them, so there's plenty of different options to go from, and I tried to make sure that they are all mixed in different ways, different types of processing, various different styles. And as I said, within the contact instrument and within Trigger, pitch controls work really well to give you different sounds without degrading the sound too much. Cool. So instantly two very, very different sounding snare drums there, mixed and processed in completely different ways. This one sounds like kind of a classic kind of mid-2000s kind of metalcore fat snare drum. You can hear some of these samples are, mixed in different ways in terms of how bright they are. This one's a little bit darker sounding, which you could brighten up if you wanted to. I wanted there to be, a bit of scope in terms of like the levels of brightness and that kind of thing as well. And you can hear on this sample that there's a good amount of ring in there. I really like a nice sustain and ring on my snare drums. I never like to dampen them too much, and with like moon gel and that kind of thing. I think in a mixed context it just really helps the drum kind of sustain a bit, and you just don't hear just like a blip, and having a bit of sustain and adds a bit of life and a bit of energy and a bit of heaviness to me. When I pick the snare drum that I like the sound of, I'll typically load in the overhead mic and blend it in as well. Now another thing you can also do is blend in just two different close mic sounds, and the overheads as well. So you just need to check that they're all in phase with each other, and the best way to check if something is in phase is to try and make it sound as out of phase as possible. So I'm going to show you what I mean. And when something sounds out of phase, it usually sounds kind of thin and lacks low end. So let's try and make this sample work with this one. And you can hear they're in two different tunings. So the best way to get them in phase is to match the tunings. But for now, I'm just going to try and make them sound as out of phase as possible. And then as soon as they're out of phase, flip the phase on one of them and it should be sounding pretty good. So let's listen to that in solo. Cool, so if I pitch this one down -14, same as that one, and invert the phase, it sounds pretty thin. So they're probably near enough in the same tuning. Now I might want to spend a bit more time really listening into the ring of the drums and making sure that the pitches really line up. But instantly that sounds pretty out of phase. So with this phase button engaged, so when I take it out, they sound pretty in phase. You hear all that fatness comes back in. So what you can do then is just blend in the two snare close mics and see which one you kind of favor in terms of the volume in the mix. Another thing that's really cool is taking a snare drum like this really low sounding one here, which is really fat, really deep and low and thuddy sounding, and blending in a higher, more cranked snare and seeing if you can get those to work together, because there's characteristics in each of those different drums that the other one doesn't have. So sometimes you can get a really well-rounded snare sound by combining samples of kind of opposite snare characteristics. But these ones may be a little bit harder to get in phase, but let's try and do it. Anyway, I'm going to go back to how I had it originally. So this snare with the overhead mic blended in as well. So next I'm going to trigger a room mic sound, and it's going to be triggered off this audio file here. Now this is slightly different, I'll get to that in a bit, but essentially we're on a stereo track because the room mic samples are in stereo. So it's good to make sure if you're in a program like Cubase that you have got the track set to stereo, otherwise it might just come up mono as default. So I've got the exact same snare sample, but the room mic loaded up here with the exact same pitch variation, and then we can blend that in and you're going to hear a bit more natural ambience. Now there were really great rooms in this drum mix because we went to Chapel Studios to record the drums, but it really helps having room mic samples to add more consistency in your room mic sound, and particularly if you record drums in a small studio that doesn't have a nice natural ambience, you can add in that artificial ambience with TCI files. That's the best way to do it, as opposed to just trying to rely on reverb. Cool. So again, that's a great sounding snare drum. No processing other than just having trigger running with those TCI files. Up next, let's check out some toms. So one thing I like to do with toms, which admittedly my friend Chris Clancy, who works with Colin Richardson, who's worked on Machine Head, amongst various other high profile metal bands, is he sometimes just blends in overhead mics and also a room mic with his toms, which sometimes you don't necessarily want quite as roomy sounding as your snare drum, because it can sometimes take away from the fatness of toms if you've got a little bit too much room mic clouding them up. So let's load up the TCI files. Toms, it was the 10-inch, and we're going to put the room mic in there as well. I'm going to bring that down in level. So this is how the natural toms sound. And then wanted to try and match that exact pitch, which you don't necessarily always have to do if you are just relying completely on triggered sounds. You can, use drum tom samples that are in a different tuning. Same with snare drums, but I figured I'd just try and match the exact same pitch. So this first tom is kind of just got a bit of everything in there, and let's see how it sounds. So again, I'm triggering off these hit click files which I made, which I'll get to later. That's how that sounds. You can add in a bit more of the overhead. Gives it a nice bit of clack. And then just a little bit of ambience from the room mic. Real room mic sounds on toms aren't always necessarily something that you want to hear a ton of in the mix, even if you really want like a big roomy sound. Sometimes really loud toms in the room mics can just sound a bit too mid-rangey, and you kind of lose a bit of the fatness in the impact of the drum if you want to get a bit more of a fat sounding tom. But if you're just kind of lazily wanting everything in one place, you can just load all of these up and have your tom ambience on the same track here. Cool. So that's something that I've also done on all of the other toms here. So that is how it sounds without doing any mixing, no EQ, no compression, literally just loading up these TCI files and just balancing out the volume in the mix. I've just duplicated the snare track. I'm going to show you the best way to trigger these sounds from the real drums. Okay, so I've got a new instance of Slate Trigger running, and what I'm going to do now, this is the snare track, but I'm going to take something like this kick drum here, this close mic sound. You could do it with a kick, but you could do it with any, like a snare as well. And I'm going to turn this kick sound into a really, really short kind of controlled blip of a sound using this envelope filter. So this is the snare track, but as I just said, I've loaded up a kick drum sample and I've just turned it into this kind of blip by just taking the sustain and release right down. I'm going to create a file that we're then going to use to trigger off the snare. Now you could just have Slate Trigger running off your raw snare track, but I'm going to show you why it's a good practice to make hit click files, which is something I learned from Scott Atkins, who co-produced the latest record with us and has produced many records by us in the past. He's worked with Colin Richardson, did Behemoth, Vader, Cradle of Filth, tons of great bands. Anyway, so this is a technique that he uses that I now use. So hypothetically speaking, let's say this snare track, which is, as you can see, is very consistent. Ali is a super consistent hitter. Let's say you've got someone that's not quite as consistent, and some of these snare drums, for example, are a little bit quieter. Now, it might be that when you get to this section here, this hit that I've made quieter, if you just had trigger running on this track, it's going to trigger a lower velocity hit there when you might want this all to be flattened out and be really consistently hard hitting. You might not want it to be 127 like the hardest hits when you're going really fast, but you want it to be consistently hard hits. So I would create a file to trigger from that's separate to the real snare drum file. So for example, if this wasn't chopped out here, this hit that I just made quieter, what you could do, if this was a weak hit, which it isn't, is just chop it out either side and just gain it up. And that way, what you're feeding into trigger is going to match the velocity of the other hits. And you want to make sure that if you're trying to trigger all really hard, high velocity hits, that's what it looks like, that it's really reaching the top threshold. And then when it comes to really fast, dynamic snare rolls that you want to sound really realistic and natural, you can chop them up. As you can see, I've done it already on these files here, and kind of just have a bit more control over the samples that are being fired. So let's listen to, this is how the snare sample sounds that we used previously. Now, some of those hits are being chopped off, so we need to bring the detail down. So if you wanted these to sound a bit more aggressive and louder, you could chop it out and just gain it up. So obviously pulling it all the way up to that amount is just going to make it fire at the hardest velocity, and it's not going to replicate the dynamics in which that snare roll was originally played at. And this hit here, you can see is a bit harder than the others. And sometimes the TCI files might not sync up exactly with the way it sounds on the raw snare. So although this hit here looks a lot louder and is triggering a much harder velocity hit from the samples, it's not actually sounding that different to the other hits on the real snare track. It's just probably just a bit more tone to it. So we could actually gain it down and just play around with the dynamics, with how much level you're sending in to trigger, to try and get it to mimic the exact kind of nuances of the real drumming. And you could be checking this out with a sample loaded up, like a snare sample, to see how it sounds. But ultimately it's quite handy just to have a separate file to your real snare to trigger off. So what you can do, for example, let's say I've brought the detail down here in Slate Trigger to capture some of the nuances in the rolls. But if I go a little bit too low here, maybe if the sensitivity was turned up a bit, it's going to start triggering off these tom hits, which are these hits here, the quieter ones, which you don't want. So what I would go and do, which is quite tedious, but if you're being really, precise about this kind of thing, is make sure that you're chopping out sections where it might misfire off something else. So you can see this bit here of audio, if I gain it up, those are the tom rolls from here. I would just delete that, and I'd go through the whole snare track, for example, and just listen to it in solo and make sure, like also within the fast sections, that nothing is being triggered off non-snare hits. So again, if there are really dynamic rolls where he's hitting the snare really quietly, you need to bring the detail down to be able to capture that. But as I said, you also don't want to be getting misfires from other drums. So you can see these bits here, if we zoom in, if I gain it up a little bit, that looks like just really light snare drum hits. That could look like ghost notes, but it's actually these floor tom hits. So again, I would chop them out and just make sure you go through the track, listen to the whole thing in solo, and make sure that nothing is triggering from other drums. So it can take you a bit of time, and once you've done that, I'd go through and export the entire song using this blip sound here, which is actually a kick drum, but you just need anything with a good solid transient for trigger to then go off. So then you're going to import that into your session, and here's one that I've already done previously. So this is the snare room trigger track, so the room mics. So this is how it sounds. So in this instance, it's not like a kick drum sound, but it's just anything with a really solid transient that you're going to feed into Slate Trigger to then resample from. And this will be a great track to trigger from, because you will have been through your snare track, deleted all the hits where it might accidentally misfire, and then you've got a really clean track to trigger from. So this is how it sounds, as I said, in solo. but we're actually triggering these room mic samples. So what I did for this track, this is again firing off the room mic sample, is I ironed everything out. So everything that's meant to be a hard hit, when exporting, I would have gone in and said, okay, maybe this hit here is not the hardest hit. Maybe it wouldn't be firing a 127 velocity hit if that's what you want, and I'd gain it up. And if this was going to be accidentally misfiring anything there, chop it out and just make sure it's not misfiring. So then when it comes to exporting it, you've just got these really good clean files to trigger from. Now also, it's worth noting that they're not bounced that loudly, so what I've done in order to make sure that that is firing off the highest velocity is just gain it up with the input that we're feeding into trigger. If I bring it down, it's just going to trigger the lower velocity hits. And all of the dynamics will be left intact for some of the more dynamic rolls like this one here. Another really cool trick you can do with like these TCI files is if you're just wanting to use real drums, like real close mics, and you've got a really great performance, really great sounding drum, been recorded really well, tuned well, you can get this snare sound to sound great. That's the raw snare sound. No problem in using all real drums in the mix, but something that really helps with the consistency of ironing out real drums is actually backing them up with triggered room mic ambience. You're really feeding in that kind of consistent punch to the ambience of the snare whilst maintaining all the clarity or the dynamics or the realism of a completely real snare. So that is basically how you can go from having completely unprocessed raw drums, at least we're talking about the kick, snare and the toms here, not the cymbals, and just instantly loading up these sample files in Trigger and instantly just having completely pro sounding drums without touching any EQ or compression.